Hello and welcome. My name is Rebecca Reardon and today I'm going to share with you my own personal relationship with empire. So the presentation has been designed to guide you through a very personal, reflective and analytical discovery. It's a discovery that I feel fundamentally challenges my ideas of my own self-identity and the concepts of the world around me. Unsurprisingly, the enlightenment, or discovery as I like to call it, made me feel very unstable. It made me feel vulnerable and confused and, above all else, very much inspired. So the main objectives then for the presentation is to allow me to reflect more deeply on this process of discovery in order to understand why this discovery did not happen earlier. Most significantly, I'll argue that the challenges that I faced during my journey are significant and axiomatic to colonial and post-colonial discourses. So we'll begin with an incident. And significantly, it's this incident that's paramount in motivating my journey to discovery. And it all began with Introduction to Critical and Cultural Theory. Essentially, the early parts of critical and cultural theory seemed to cement my own personal ideas that a dominant ideology was indeed in play and thus an oppressive force in society that existed. It's something that I had spent hours and hours over the last few years trying to unscramble in my own head. However, whilst engaging with the theorists on whiteness and white privilege and dealing with the issues of racism, what I'd not expected to confront was the idea that I played an active role in this oppressive, dominating ideology. The seminar on whiteness and white privilege really served as a catalyst for the mind-blowing, smoke out of my ears frustration that you can see depicted there in the screen in front of you. In this seminar, I used an example of racism that was directed towards myself, a white person, from someone of a different colour. This to me was proof that as a white person, I was not privileged. The tutor's response to my example created the dual situation you can see nicely depicted there in front of you of the two wildebeests at loggerheads. Basically, the tutor's suggestion was that although the situation was not a very nice one, I could use the experience positively. Essentially, what the tutor was suggesting was that I could now understand how thousands of non-white people had felt for decades. It was insistent that although I'd been at the receiving end of the racism, I nevertheless was the one with the privilege. In this sense, he meant that I could leave the situation much more easily than someone that is not white or of my own colour. Whereas if the boot had been on the other foot, it wouldn't have been as simple. What the hell was my tutor suggesting? Was he suggesting that I should accept racism to be justified as a lesson for being white and my cultural heritage and historical ancestors? I just couldn't understand how he was suggesting that this was my fault. I've never considered myself to be nasty to non-whites, and so therefore I didn't think that I was racist. You could say that I spat my dummy out of the cot and became this over-defensive person, unwilling to see it from any other angle but my own. In hindsight, I was unhappy and embarrassed by my reaction to the tutor, and I've always considered myself to be a fair and open-minded person, so why then did this issue provoke this irrational reaction? Getting to the core of my reaction was the first step in my personal discovery. It's a step that I feel provided a rationale for my very unrational response, and Peggy McIntosh sums this up in a nutshell. And she argues, if you'd like to look at your screen, I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not invisible systems conferring dominance. Now, the linguistic significance of the phrase taught, which is highlighted there on your screen in red, it made sense of my defensive response to the issues of white privilege. Because, like McIntosh, I'd been taught to see racism in individual acts of meanness, and therefore I was unable to see racism as being directed in any other way. My justification, moreover, for rejecting the experience of racial targeting as an opportunity for me to empathise and sympathise with non-whites was fundamentally because I believed wholeheartedly that those ideas of imperialism, colonialism and empire had ended with the abolition of the slave trade and were therefore not my responsibility. What became evident, though, through determination to reflect on these issues and further study, was the idea that my knowledge base might not be correct. After all, I wasn't impressed with the way I reacted to the tutor, and I did fundamentally think that I was very open-minded and quite receptive to all this. So that kind of served as the motivating factor for my determination to pull this nasty reaction apart and really get to the core of why I reacted in such a defensive way. And I realised that before this incident, I'd never really questioned my knowledge base, which is really laughable because I'm a history student and I spend a large part of my life questioning life events. I'd nevertheless never applied this to the very language that provides the foundation for my own cultural makeup as it stands now. After all, reflecting on scholars such as Leonard Suess and Ruth Frankenberg, who assert that our whole racial epistemology is provided by and for the oppressor. This was a point at which the theories of Michel Foucault and the dynamics of power really started to hit home, and I could engage, and I felt like I got a fairly sophisticated understanding about the dynamics of power and Michel Foucault, and I actually read Discipline and Punishment over the summer, and I could really get on board with what he was saying. But what started to happen was I was able to see a link from Michel Foucault's idea of knowledge being at the hub of power and post-colonial theories and ideas of racism, imperialism and colonialism. His thesis asserts that knowledge then is at the absolute hub of power, and it's in this sense that we can use epistemology to deconstruct the essence of power, which will therefore reveal the power that's legitimising this knowledge, and it focuses primarily on who knowledge is presented to and who knowledge is presented for. And like I said earlier, scholars have reflected on this and looked at different epistemologies of racism and how that they're very much put forward by the white oppressor and received by the white oppressor. So therefore the colonised is kind of suppressed and it's not even mentioned. So obviously when I started to apply these theories to some of the knowledge bases that I took as solid truths, then cracks began to appear. My example is going to be William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce is the guy on your screen there, and he's often attributed as a leading figure in the abolition of the slave trade movement, and in this light is seen as the national hero. Now, using Wilberforce, the theories of Michel Foucault really begin to take hold, because Wilberforce is white, and this is significant as is symbolic of a shift in ideology, and it's a shift that moves away from the barbaric actions of the white man in the slave trade to the white moral emancipation movement that comes with the historical characteristics of Wilberforce. And it's in terms of these power dynamics that Wilberforce is therefore symbolic of white dominance, and in this sense the fact that the history of the slave trade is presented by the white invader settler and not the colonised victim suggests that another voice is therefore being suppressed at the expense of the white national hero that's actually the one that's expelling the knowledge. So it could be suggested then that Wilberforce and his heroic status of emancipator is a cultural spectacle and representation which is predominantly aimed at white Europeans, and most significantly the fact that Wilberforce as an epistemology of the slave trade is fundamentally presented by and for the oppressor, the white settler invader, suggests that it's still the dominant force of power. So it's still very much in control. This idea of empire hasn't gone away. It's obviously still there. It's just manifesting itself in a different way. What can be suggested then is that although that there was a clear shift in ideology towards the slaves with the abolition of the slave trade movement, the oppressive logic that served as the rationale for the slave trade is still very much then in force. Further research into Wilberforce allowed me to underpin the idea of an oppressive logic, and it was with the help of his Oxford Dictionary of National Biographer, Jack Wolfe, and his assertion that Wilberforce had an ulterior motive with his regards to the slave trade, and that his lifelong mission was to spread the forces of Christianity and white civilization, that was the superior ideology, and that his whole mission for the colonized became this liberating spreading of civilization. And it's with Wilberforce that this turning point really does take hold. So what we get with Wilberforce then is a distinct shift from violence in terms of colonising and the discourse on empire to justification that's provided basically through a rationale of civilization. And Dr. Kath Ellis would like to argue in her paper on the possessive white logic that this is the way that nations come to fruition, and it's through a shared set of cultural representations which together constitute a set of narratives and stories, and it's this that's fundamental because it's this that holds the whole dominating system in together. It's this that fuses it, the idea that these stories and myths that are there that can justify and provide a history and justification for the continuance of oppression by the white settler invader. The ramifications of this serve to provide a rationale for the British imperial project, and it's one that Eileen Morton Robinson takes up, and she argues that the British imperial project was predictated on taking possession of other people's lands and resources for, as you can see on your screen, the benefit of the empire, highlighted there in red. The right to take possession was embedded in British and international common law, and it was thus rationalised through a discourse of civilisation that supported war. This suggests that the switch in ideology moved from an act of complete explicit possession to an act of spreading peace and promoting Christian moral codes, which ultimately provides a justification for the act of possession and taking of lands. The very idea of promoting and spreading Christianity as the essence of civilization and the essence of white civilization is really at the yoke of this possessive logic. And we can see this in action today. For instance, the United Nations, which works as a kind of umbrella organisation that's designed to maintain peace, which, on the other hand, maintaining peace means promoting this white civilization logic, which Dr. Kath Ellis calls the possessive white logic. Now, the flip side to all this is that in order to understand the essence of this concept, it's all well and good knowing about it. However, to accept that our rationale and knowledge base is oppressive and therefore suppressing other voices, then it means that you've got to accept that your own cultural makeup and your own self-identity is fundamentally at the expense of the other. So if these ideas then all come together and really hold weight and they make sense, then the racial oppression and the suffering of the third world that we can see every day when we turn on our TVs, in the news, the charity organisations that are set up to try to help these people, then if we see all this as making sense, then what really you have to confront is the idea that our lives are causing this kind of oppression. If we are still the dominating force and the ideology behind the rationale which was used to take people's lands, and we do it for the benefit of the empire. Nothing's really changed there, just a switch in ideology. They're still very much oppressed and still not allowed to come through in a voice, either in historical terms or at the present. And in order to understand this is to fundamentally destabilise your whole cultural identity. In order to accept the idea that somehow I'm responsible for the possessive white logic and that I'm part of it, is to completely dismiss the foundations of my own self-identity, which in this sense explains my reaction towards the tutor, because I was defending my own self-identity, and this is everything that I believe the world to be, which has got to be a scary process of deconstruction, like Neo in The Matrix, when he's presented with 2 pills by Morpheus, and Morpheus explains to him that it's like a splinter in your mind, this idea that the world isn't as it should be. It's kind of like we see racial oppression every day, and we see starvation in the third world, and we see it as like Neo sees his own self as being not quite right, and he's offered 2 pills, which is kind of like being able to accept the information that's presented to you, because on the one hand you can take the blue pill, which is attributed with the binary opposition desire, which in Freud's eyes is your very existence. It's your essence of knowledge, and the fact that it's stable and it's comfortable and it allows you to stay within this bubble where everything is really centred and stable, and allows you to ignore the fact that you're an active agent in the rationale of oppression. This blue pill allows you to see past all that and keeps you well within this safe boundary. However, on the other hand, you could take the red pill, which would mean to separate yourself completely from the possessive white logic, and thus you'd see the truth, or as Jacques Lacan would like to call it, the real. Now, he talks about being inducted into culture, and he says that this happens during the mirror stage, and we're not signed up to this culture, it's constructed. We follow another's projection, projected image that we then model ourselves on. It's not something that's natural or essential. It's something that's constructed, and in this case it's white civilization logic. And what he says is that because it isn't essential, and because it's not inherent in everyone from birth, that we're actually inducted into this, that there are gaps that are created in the language system. And it's these that I think are the gaps that Morpheus is talking about in The Matrix, that there's a splinter in your mind and you can see this kind of thing, but the fact that the opposite to desire, the binary opposition desire, is fear. And obviously when presented with the blue pill and the red pill, if the ramifications were that it would end world starvation and suffering, then everybody would surely jump at the chance of taking the red pill. However, the red pill and its fundamental association with the binary opposition fear, as Freud would like to argue, associates separation with danger. Therefore, in a society that's built on stability and morals like the white logic, then the red pill is not appealing, and it acts as a deterrent, because the realisation that in order to help or destroy this system, in order to help these people that are suffering and to destroy the system that legitimises that, it means to lose the benefits that come with empire. And this is where most people that subscribe to this system of possessive white logic, subconsciously inducted into culture, like Cypher in The Matrix, he knows that these things are there and he knows that they're operating. However, he asserts that ignorance is bliss, and I think this is it in a nutshell, that in order to do something about this kind of thing and in order to see it for what it is, it means that you're going to have to lose something to help better the situation for thousands of others that our lives are suppressing. And I think Terry Eagleton kind of reinforces this view, that he asserts that your taste is more otherworldly than third world, and you'll find yourself somewhat dismissive of the real history of the other. And it's true. I've heard the saying 1,000 times that so long as you know that your family are all right, then you know, you're not, the possessive white logic is that you look after your family and you uphold these moralistic civilization codes that then benefit you and your family, are going to provide a better future, and so on and so forth. So in order to go against that is to go against everything that you've been taught, because another thing that's significant is that the opposite side to desire is fear. That there are no words in that binary opposition to really articulate an alternative, because the voice of the other is suppressed, and therefore there's no other association, which it's like looking at a blank page. We don't know what's on the other side, and therefore it's associated primarily with fear and danger. And I think this really takes us on to the idea that we can deconstruct these national stories and these cultural representations that have been left for us quite obviously by the white settler invader, and for us as white settler invaders to receive this information. And as Slavoj Žižek would like to argue, that we feel free because we lack the very language to articulate freedom. And it's in this sense that this whole world, an idea of civilization, really holds together, because like we were saying before, the opposite to desire is fear, and there's no language to articulate what's beyond that. However, if we do see this and we do make the move, there are lots of things that you can do to disengage yourself with this system of oppression and white logic. And if you look at the world there on the screen, how I see ideas of empire now, us, every individual who subscribes or is inducted into this idea of civilization, is thus another piece of the jigsaw that keeps it together. And the more people that make this realisation and stop subscribing to the system, for instance voting and supporting these agencies that are there, like the United Nations, in enforcing this peace code, then another piece of the jigsaw puzzle will inevitably fall off. And I'd like to really end it with a kind of positive note, because I do think that I'm quite a positive person, and I'd like to just pick up on the fact that Žižek says that we feel free because we lack the very language to articulate freedom. And I think that because there's no language that articulates the other, and the opposite to desire is fear, we could try to take a more optimistic approach to the binary opposition fear, and try to, because we don't know that ultimately there's going to be danger, or there's going to be fear, or there's going to be a loss, if we look at it in a more optimistic way, that something's going to be gained from doing this, that people are going to be liberated and saved, and thus emancipated from this possessive white logic, then that's something that's really positive. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that I've made sense and hopefully guided you through a very personal discovery that I've made of my own self-identity and I hope that this is going to be an ongoing reflective piece, because it's by no means the end of the road, and there's lots more conclusions and deeper reflective understanding that can be done in order to separate myself from this possessive white logic that I was unable to see before now. And I really hope that you've enjoyed the presentation today, and thank you very much for listening.